Today I'm going to speak about the religious pluralism of Rabbi Irving Greenberg as a pragmatic rather than a postmodern pluralism. Until recently, religious pluralism was an anomaly. To be orthodox meant to be tied to fundamental absolutes, dogmatic religious claims. Etymologically, orthodox means ortho, the right, true, doxa, opinion. Thus, orthodoxy in its traditional definition cannot be aligned with pluralism because whilst one suggests the existence of only one true opinion, the other suggests the existence of many true opinions. Orthodoxy suggested God's moral code was the only one possessing intrinsic and eternal truth. Contrary to this, pluralism denotes the belief in a plurality of beliefs or truths. It's locally bound, relative, and limited. It emphasizes the cultural, historical, and individual perspectives as arbiters in an evolving or relative truth system. From the first half of the 20th century, pluralism began to radicalize as the negation of truth led down the road of radical relativism and nihilism, where meaning, value, morality was usurped. This kind of deconstruction affiliated with postmodernism left any discussion of truth or untruth or even subjective truths at the door. Judaism is not immune to the influence of this type of postmodern outlook. A greater number of Jewish youth are choosing to eschew the conventional religious frameworks, opting for a more authentic and lived expression of their religious identity that engages with postmodern concepts and ideas. This being the case, how can we speak of religious pluralism? How can a religious thinker adopt or approach a postmodern world and be aligned with the pluralistic conception of reality? Irving Greenberg's writing is one example of how one can straddle the epistemological dissonance associated with the religious pluralism. And today I want to examine his stance. Rabbi Irving Greenberg is an American Orthodox theologian. Born in 1933 in America, he was ordained at the Bet Yosef Yeshiva and earned a doctorate from Harvard. Greenberg is primarily known as a post-Holocaust thinker. He wrote his doctorate on Roosevelt, and his academic training was in American intellectual history. But over the years, he veered into the theological camp, starting as a post-Holocaust theologian and moving into the general area of religious theology, and becoming a leading American religious thinker, teacher, and social activist. His thought focuses on certain key principles in Jewish tradition, such as the Tselem Elokim, the divine image of each individual, and the subsequent corollaries to this idea, the notion of covenant and how this plays out in the historical development of the people of Israel, and the central value that usurps all, the value of life, its preservation, manifestation, and perpetuation. Pluralism in general is usually characterized by the belief in multiple truths or views, none of which have a monopoly on the one way, or the truth with a capital T. Such a view, by its very nature, will be relativist. That is, it doesn't possess any absolute or objective value or claim. But this is a creation of a limited and conceptualized perspective. But it is a creation of a limited and conceptualized perspective. Classic postmodernists deny the existence of absolute universal truth. When truth foundations are denied, there is a natural spiral or natural tendency into the abyss of radical relativism and nihilism. This kind of hard pluralism is not the kind that we encounter in Greenberg's thought. His pluralism is allied to a soft pluralism that situates truth within the subjective construct of each individual or faith group or community, thus affirming the existence of truth, but in a limited capacity. In this sense, the existence or denial of an absolute truth is not really of much significance. Rather, the integrity of individual belief is what dictates one's commitment. My contention is that the type of soft pluralism advanced by Greenberg is akin to the pluralism found in the American pragmatist tradition. It is one that engages in a dual allegiance to self and other, taking our own positions and value systems seriously and committedly, while simultaneously being open to truly hearing and internalizing the position of the other. I will begin by briefly exploring Richard Bernstein's analysis of pluralism that differentiates between the postmodern and pragmatic concepts of pluralism in order to situate Greenberg within that framework. I will then go on to highlight three aspects of Greenberg's religious pluralism that is analogous to the pragmatic pluralism: fallibilism, constructive over deconstructive pluralism, and contingency. So I begin with Bernstein. Pluralism can adopt many guises, as we see in the era in which we live, many of which are trite and superficial. Richard Bernstein, in an article entitled Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Healing of Wounds, provides examples of these types of pluralism, such as fragmenting pluralism, where we only manage to communicate with a small group that shares our own biases; a flabby pluralism whose sharings are little more than what he calls glib, superficial poachings; or even defensive pluralism, where we pretend to pay attention to the other, but it's little more than lip service. Pragmatism, on the other hand, according to Bernstein, purports what he terms engaged fallibilistic pluralism. This type of pluralism, based on fallibilism, which is a pragmatic principle, engages in a dual allegiance to self and other, as I already said, taking the other's position seriously and committedly, but being open to truly hearing and internalizing the other. A pluralism based on fallibilism, as Bernstein purports, is protected against the misdemeanors of other types of pluralism explicated above, and fosters the possibility of finding common ground on which to create a community of inquirers. Proper inquiry, then, is not a method, as he said, is not a method of belief preservation, but of belief revision and correction. And now, so that takes us to the three principles I want to examine, where we're going to see a parallel between the pragmatic pluralistic concept and Greenberg's perception of pluralism. Number one, fallibilism. Fallibilism is the view that no empirical statement is impervious to epistemological challenge. For the classic postmodernists, epistemology is defunct. There's nothing we can know for certain. Fallibilism rejects dogmatic claims and does not insist on the truth of certainty of its own perspective. It's the natural consequence of anti-foundationalism and has become the benchmark, which has become the benchmark of the postmodern pragmatist project. Bernstein insists, however, that it is in fact the fallibilistic principle in pragmatism that ensures an optimism for progress, change, advancements of ideas, as opposed to a static state of radical relativism and nihilism, as we often see coming out of the postmodernists. In other words, what comes to save pragmatism from its nihilistic end is the fallibilistic principle, since it predicates itself on the idea that there is no belief or thesis, no matter how fundamental, that is not open to further interpretation and criticism. An acceptance of our finitude does not necessarily embrace skepticism. John Storr describes it like this. It's gone. Okay. The abandoned quest for certainty is replaced by piecemeal, multi-directional efforts to verify and warrant beliefs. Fallibilism marks the vulnerability of all dogma. This description parallels a similar sentiment found in Greenberg's thought, that the quest for truth need not be abandoned, but instead tempered. When we give up the search, we fall into nihilism. When we believe we have found an all-encompassing absolute system, we pave the road to fundamentalism. In other words, to have a fallibilistic epistemology is to neither reject absolute knowledge about things, nor to dogmatically adopt them. It sees reality and knowledge about reality as piecemeal. William James describes it when he writes, "Our knowledge grows in spots." Fallibilism allows me to hold a vulnerable truth that is open to critique and hence revision. Greenberg adopts the fallibilistic principles as a means of self-critique in a post-Holocaust landscape. I will quote a few instances where Greenberg's words sound distinctly fallibilistic. The first comes from a very early and implicit exploration of the limits of orthodoxy, entitled The Cultural Revolution and Religious Unity, written in 1967. There, in classic fallibilistic language, he states, "It means the incorporation of doubt into the religious experience. It involves teaching laymen who have been simply loyal that a greater loyalty is to be critical, even as they are faithful. It involves continual self-criticism and judgment of the world. The limit of one's epistemological view as being the cornerstone of the moral and religious personality is developed in a far deeper and theologically nuanced way after his encounter with the Holocaust and once he enters the world of interfaith dialogue. In the following extract, penned in 2006, these ideas are expressed far more explicitly. The recognition that one's own system is partial and flawed triggers the capacity to self-criticize in order to deal with these flaws. Having yielded the claims of absolute perfection, one is released to admit errors and correct them. One is even free to be ashamed of one's errors and to admire the strength and values of others. The question was asked, if so, in light of the Shoah, should one be orthodox, conservative, or reform? My reply was, after the Holocaust, it's not so important whether you are orthodox, conservative, or reform. And let me add secular, as long as you are ashamed of it. That shame is a sign of brokenness or flaw. The shock of recognition should be enough. The shock of recognition should not be confused with rejection or distancing, because one must love a system at its best enough to notice its shortcomings. One must respect a Welsh tongue enough to be ashamed of it, and one must be committed enough to stay with it and be motivated to work to correct its flaws. Thus, the sense of limitations operated to prevent outbreak of any potential evils, even as moral humility, helps move the system towards its own tikkun. And even more recently, he explicates his notion of postmodernism by stating, postmodernity incorporates the historical insights that many truths of modernity and their very strengths led to an upgrading of life and increased human dignity. When extended beyond their limits or allowed to go out and control, turn destructive or even catastrophic. And here he's obviously talking about the Holocaust. The correct response is not to reject such phenomena as universalism, industrialism, commerce, technology, bureaucracy, but employ them with limits, corrective mechanism, and countervailing forces and norms. The above extracts frame Greenberg's fallibilism in an ideological guise, but in his upcoming publication, Greenberg incorporates the fallibilistic principle not just as a corollary to the misdemeanors of the modernist principles, but also to the intrinsic mechanism of covenant, the central notion of his postmodern theology. The fallibilism of humanity is what makes the principle of covenant plausible. The fact that a perfect being enters into a pact with an imperfect people is testament to the strength and weight of the covenantal mission. Of course, the deeper lesson is that Jews in the Bible are very human. That is part of the reason that God chose them. In other words, their fallibility makes them a perfect case. If people with all these human limitations can carry God's covenant, then all the world can do it. If God can keep loving this people with their failures, then God can love all of humanity. So says Greenberg. In all these examples, the fallibilistic principle form a central component of Greenberg's postmodern outlook, which bolsters our hypothesis that Greenberg's postmodernism is a natural affiliate to pragmatism rather than strict pluralism in the relativist sense. The second category I want to look at, which continues to show us this parallel between American pragmatism's conception of pluralism and Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg's, is the notion of constructive versus deconstructive. The deconstruction and disillusionment, so instructive in the postmodern discourse, is strongly apparent in Greenberg's early responses to the Holocaust. For many postmoderns, this deconstruction is analogous with the inadequacy of language, being, knowledge in expressing anything about reality. It thus creates a schism that is unbridgeable between the world and our perception of it. It's this schism that fuels the refusal or incapacity to create affirmative ethical constructs. But he builds his theology, though we detect explicit statements of despair and deconstruction, towards constructing an affirmative ethical position. That's analogous in many ways to the postmodernism we see in the pragmatist tradition. If we use the voluntary covenant as an example of Greenberg's theological development, the voluntary covenant being one of the main areas that Greenberg develops, we see that the despair and destitution he describes in vivid, emotive, and often shattering ways are tempered by the subsequent calls to human responsibility, to agency in the process towards liberation of the universe and humankind. There's a kind of revelatory moment that comes as a response to the shattering of all previous paradigms. He writes, "What is the message to us? What is the message to us when the divine presence was in Auschwitz, suffering, burning, starving, yet despite the most desperate pleas, failing to stop the Shoah? The divine presence need not speak through prophets or rabbis. The presence speaks for itself. If the message of the destruction of the temple was that Jews were called to greater partnership and responsibility in the covenant, then the Shoah is even more drastic call for total Jewish responsibility for the covenant. If after the temple's destruction, Israel moved from junior participant to true partner in the covenant, then after the Shoah, the Jewish people is called upon to become the senior partner in action." Hard postmodernism is one that deconstructs without hope. Soft postmodernism situates us within the void, but allows us to rebuild and restructure from within the void. Greenberg's construction is one that is situated from within the covenantal structure rather than the subjective individualistic one. His pragmatism is the driving force behind his ethical pluralism. In the end, Greenberg circumvents the pessimistic conclusions of postmodernism that remain in their ephemeral transitory moment of rupture meaningless, and instead allows for organic growth that elicits meaningful structures in place of the postmodern vertigo. My contention remains that the analogous sentiments of rupture and alienation that characterize the postmodern self are ones we see in Greenberg's early post-Holocaust theology, and hence his burgeoning affinity with their school of thought is a natural outgrowth of this visceral and rupturing experience. The third area of parallel between Greenberg and what I have termed pragmatic pluralism, is contingency, number 3. There has always been a tension in philosophy between the determined, the fixed, and the dynamic and the contingent. Pragmatists following Leibniz see the world and existence in constant fluctuation, much like the Hegelian method of dialectical development. The pragmatists understood truth and reality to be in constant movement, though they would not concur with Hegel's ultimate synthesis. Much of our time is spent assessing how we respond to contingencies or to the unforeseeable. Putnam, summarizing Dewey's position, states, and again, these are both American pragmatists, philosophies arise out of time-bound reactions to specific problems faced by human beings in given cultural circumstances. If a philosopher can contribute to the reasoned resolution of some of the peoples of his or her time, that is in no small achievement. And that's one of her assumptions will in the future no doubt have to be one of the assumptions that will in the future no doubt have to be qualified or even rejected is only to be expected. Our task as philosophers isn't to achieve immortality. We could add a speculative dimension to this by suggesting that pragmatic philosophy's disinterest in foundational premises reflects America as a country without deep foundations. From the perspective of white American history, America was a country with a clean slate on which they built a society based on a working ethic of trial and error. Whereas in Europe, the preoccupation with ultimate philosophical foundations reflected the strong foundations of tradition and precedent inherent in the historical and cultural dimensions of the countries. They retained a belief in the importance of seeking the solid foundations to truth. For the pragmatists, as reflected in the early American founding fathers, it was far more about what worked. This national mythology of we built a country and hence we can build a philosophy too. As I've been arguing, Greenberg's propensity towards pragmatism influences his theological musings. The notion of contingency is seen reflected in Greenberg's vision of the halachic system, which stands as the philosophical backbone of Judaism. For Greenberg, Judaism is not an endpoint. It's not final. It's a work in progress, an ethical project that demands constant revisions and reclassifications. It's built on an incremental vision of a perfected world, but one that's formed from a contingent reality. The fundamentalism and authoritarianism associated to Orthodox Judaism is for him an enigma to its authenticity. The realm of what might be is what informs much of Greenberg's vision, but the is and ought are still lurking in the background and in many ways act as the net that refuses to release him from the clutch of halachic fidelity. The what may be adds a contingent aspect to Jewish legalism that's emblematic of Greenberg's thought regarding halakha and is a key feature of contingency allied to neo-pragmatism. Yet what sets Greenberg apart from the pragmatists and neo-pragmatists is his dual allegiance to both contingency as part of a normative law system and the transcendental divine elements of that self-same law system. The principle informing this tension is at the heart of the dissonance of being a religious Orthodox pluralist. Does being a Jew committed to halachic lifestyle render me impotent to radical chain and contingent scenarios? His rendition of Jewish history as a movement towards greater human involvement and responsibility contains a strong phenomenological component that renders halakha a developing and transformative corpus dependent on societal and human affairs. In this sense, fidelity to halakha would be nothing more or less than fidelity to societal norms or narrative. Halakha becomes fully normative rather than authoritative or revelatory. In this guise, Greenberg's theology could fit seamlessly into the line of pragmatic theory. I contend, however, that for Greenberg at least, it is not seamless, and that the tension between the divine authority and the human construct sits at the heart of his own personal struggles, both with the Holocaust and within orthodoxy itself, and leaves us wondering if he can succeed in promoting a truly pluralistic Judaism.